Now, right now, though, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Grace Elizabeth Hale. She is the author of In the Pines, A Lynching, a Lie, and a Reckoning. Dr. Hale is from Atlanta, Georgia. She now lives and works in Charlottesville. She is professor of American Studies at UVA, my alma mater, so wahoo wah. And she has also received her undergraduate and graduate training from the University of Georgia. During her studies, she also played in a band and opened a cafe and knows a great deal about music. I was actually looking at your YouTube video on Cool Town the other day. And then she also, in 1998, wrote Making Whiteness, and she was one of the early scholars looking at white supremacy, and this is a really amazing book, so if you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to. It's a wealth of information. But today we're here to hear a more personal story, a story that relates to her family life and to the lynching of a man in a Mississippi town. And we are very pleased that she is here to share the story of her grandfather, who was a sheriff in that town, and also the lynching of Versie Johnson's life. And it took courage to talk about this perspective of the story, and this story reminds us that there is always a chance for choice, but it also talks about a period of time bound by white supremacy and how it has an impact on an American family. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Grace Elizabeth Hale. Thank you.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here today, and I'm thankful any of you turned out, given that it's finally not cold and there's not ice on the ground and there's things to do outdoors. So thank you for coming. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this book, read a few brief passages, show you a few pictures, but really try to leave some room for conversation. I'm certainly not going to give you an academic presentation. Probably will clock in about 3 hours. Does that sound good? Really, it's much shorter than that. I can never resist. Historians are so long-winded. We kind of have to make fun of ourselves, right? We are. So this book is very different from Making Whiteness, which was my dissertation, and then it became my first book, and was the book that really made my career. I'm a historian, a long-term member of the history department at the University of Virginia, and one of the founders of American Studies there. And so that book really sort of launched my life as a historian, but always in the background of that book was this book, or this story. This is really an intimate family story, something of a true crime tale, but also, of course, a history. And like all histories, it starts with its own story. So I really learned, as many people do, this is such a cliche that we actually caution people not to write it on their applications when they're applying to grad school in history. But it is a cliche, but in my case it's also true that I really in many ways came to love history because of the storytelling of my older relatives, and especially my grandfather. So I should say that to start, but he was dead and I was in college when my mom first told me the story at the center of this book. And it's really a story straight out of To Kill a Mockingbird. And it's about an incident that happened when my mom was 10, so that would be 1947. And my grandfather, whose name is Ori Berry, was the sheriff of Jefferson Davis County, Mississippi. And one day, a woman had been brought into the sheriff's office, and there was an allegation, a white woman, an allegation of rape, and a black man was arrested, and the story that my mom told me was that my grandfather spent the night at the jail, just like Atticus Finch, all night at the jail with his gun, threatening to shoot any of the people that would try to take this man out of his jail. That he said to them, you know, you're people I know, you're people who probably, some of you voted for me, but I'm not gonna let you take this person from my jail. And in my mom's accounting, my grandfather was a hero. And this story really had a profound effect on me and really inspired me to go to graduate school and to do the research that became that first book, Making Whiteness. A huge chunk of that book is about the history of lynching. But while I was in grad school, I learned some things, right? I learned how to do primary research. And so at one point I went to visit my grandmother. Again, my grandfather's already dead there, but I went to visit her in Jeff Davis County. And she didn't like to talk about the past. And I want to be fair to her. It wasn't just perhaps that she didn't want to talk about this incident. She had grown up extremely impoverished, often without enough food to eat, without shoes to wear. And so her orientation was always like ahead, right? The past was really traumatic. Her father was murdered by a neighbor, family impoverished after that. Anyway, she did not like to talk about the past, but I had those newfound research skills, you know, a little bit full of myself, as a lot of grad students are. If any of you went to grad school, you might remember that vision that you have there for a minute that you really know what you're doing. It doesn't last. But I said, I'm just going to go off and do some research, right? So I went down to the local newspaper office and started reading the back issues of the newspaper, trying to find what the newspaper had to say about my grandfather's act of heroism. And I did eventually find, I think I've got a slide of, this may not work. Okay, that's where it is, but you know what? Forget it. We'll get back to that later. I have a picture of the newspaper that I found, but right there on the front page was an article that was about the same incident that my mom had described. And there I learned the date. My mom hadn't remembered the date. It was August 1st, 1947, and I learned the name of the black man who was killed, Versie Johnson. But I also learned reading that paper, and I can say more about this if people want me to later, but I learned because of the things that I knew from my research. You know, I'd read Ida B. Wells, I'd read W.E.B. Du Bois, I knew the history of lynching by that point, and I realized quite clearly that the newspaper was lying. That the newspaper story didn't match my mom's story, so probably they were both lying, but definitely there was a mystery here. What had really happened was not clear. And the main reason that I knew that, and as I said, I can go into more details later, was because the newspaper reported that Versie Johnson had asked to be taken out of the jail back to the site of this alleged crime so that he could recount what happened. Now, no black man in Mississippi asked to be taken out of the somewhat security of the jail. This is prime lynching territory. No one's going to make that request. And so I knew that the newspaper was lying. Mississippi is famous in the 1930s for having built a mob-proof jail on the top. So imagine a 3 or 4 story courthouse building in downtown Jackson, and then they built the jail on top of the courthouse because then it would, you know, how can the mob get up there? They can guard the entrances. And so this is not the kind of place people ask to be taken out of the jail. But I have to admit, and I'm not proud to do it, that at that point, you know, my grandmother's alive, my family, much of my extended family's alive, and I really didn't have the courage to dig any farther. I don't like to admit that, but I want to because it is the truth. And I don't know that I ever would have dug any farther, knowing the story that I grew up with wasn't true, you know, and not really wanting to know what was true, if 2017 in Charlottesville hadn't happened. Now, if you've lived in Virginia since then, I probably don't need to go into the details of that incident for you, but I will just say this, that when you saw those men marching with the tiki torches, you know, that's my work site. That is where I work and have worked for 25 years. And when you saw that group of men arranged around a small group of counter-protesters that night in front of the rotunda, some of those people with those signs, those were my students. And when you saw those people fighting in the street, that was my neighborhood. Those people parked in front of my house. And they attacked my neighbors with their bats and guns. Heather Heyer was killed a few blocks from where I live. So this just really, you know, maybe in part, it took everyone in Charlottesville. It was a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. But for me as a historian, I just kept thinking, over 100 years of scholarship, you know, scholarship has been going on since the late 19th century, and still these lies about our past circulate, still people refuse to understand what the real history is. it really just struck me as a historian. I felt like we historians have failed, that we have not been able to teach other Americans the real history of this country. And I thought about the fact that we needed to help people understand that history is not abstract. Now, some people do understand that. Some families have history-keeping traditions, but many American families don't. So I wanted to sort of think about, like, how can we make people understand that history is not abstract, that it's close and it's intimate, and it's always somebody's family story. And so I thought, this is what I can do. I am a historian. This is the project I can undertake in the aftermath of this tragedy, which is to stop running away from my own family story and try to find out what really happened to Versie Johnson. Because of course Versie Johnson was killed, but you guys doing this reconciliation work, this is also of course an attack on a whole community. This is an attack on the Black community of Jefferson Davis County. And the history of that community needs to be told as well, so that we can understand what exactly is being attacked and what is lost in the aftermath. And so this book is organized around 3 main characters. So at first, it's organized around my grandfather. Obviously, he is a character in the story. It's also organized around Versie Johnson and everything that I could find out about his history. So he too is one of the central characters. And then I really think the 3rd main character here is the place where this all happened, because it's a place that I think most Americans don't know that much about. When people think about Mississippi, they think about the Delta. Maybe I can, we've got the map up here. So you can see that we're talking about south central Mississippi here. It's not the Delta that people imagine. This is not a place where there are lots of plantations. There are enslaved people here before emancipation, but not very many. This is not a place of rich soil. It's not one of those places, if you know much about this history of Mississippi, Mississippi has actually got the most millionaires in the country on the eve of the Civil War. Ever since, it has not, but it is really the booming edge of American capitalism right before the Civil War. This is a backwater, if you will. It is an area covered, lots of it is covered by old growth longleaf pine forests up through the early 20th century into the 1930s. Land is inexpensive, and this place really then becomes a part of the tale. And the fact that the land isn't good is why the Black community there flourishes. People move there after emancipation to escape the places where they were enslaved. So to escape the Delta, to escape the harsh race relations there in the Delta, and the violence. And they're able to, some Black people in this part of Mississippi homestead. There's a tiny little window when there's homesteading, people can get land for free, but also they're able to buy inexpensively land. And they start multiple versions of, I don't know if you're familiar with the term free towns, but communities of freed people are moving in and starting these communities. And so I wanted to tell the story of this place of Black flourishing, because in my experience as a historian, people either don't know anything about it and they deny the reality of white supremacy, or they know something about the reality of white supremacy and they don't understand that in spite of that, that in some places Black people were able to flourish, right? And that doesn't discount the history of white supremacy, but we also don't want to discount the history of people that, despite all that they faced, are managing to build really strong and vibrant communities. And so that community of Jeff Davis County is also part of the tale. And then the final thing that I would say, this is of interest perhaps to this group, is that this is a story about what happens to lynching over the course of the 20th century. How anti-lynching activism becomes more successful and really changes the way that, that white Southerners, who increasingly are the people doing lynching, how they practice it, and in particular, how they begin to lie about lynching and to sort of move the practice underground, and the contours of lynching are really changing in this time period. And that is one of the many reasons why our statistics are really bad about lynching. We don't really know how many people were killed. Interestingly enough, we know more about how many people are killed in the 19th century when people are bragging about it in the newspapers. By the time you get to the 1930s, especially the late 1930s, people are not bragging about it in the newspaper as much, and then you begin to have this kind of lying and obfuscation going on. So that really has hurt our counts. So those are the things that the book is about. I want to now just briefly read from 3 excerpts. One about my grandfather. It's a little bit about my grandmother too, but introducing him as a character. Then I want to tell you something and read a little bit about Versie Johnson, the other major figure here. And then I want to sort of end by just reading a little bit from the end of the book. I'm not going to tell you what I actually discovered. If you haven't read the book, the narrative hinges on you going on that journey of discovery. The true crime kind of aspect to the narrative is figuring out what really happened. But I hope to sort of leave that in suspense, but also to leave time for questions. So I'm going to just read a little bit from the book. I really want you to get a sense of the fact that this book is not your typical historian at a university writing a history book. So it's really written to be more like creative nonfiction, if that makes sense, to recreate the place and tell you a true story in a kind of novelistic fashion. That's my aspiration anyway. You can tell me if I failed, if you've read it. So here's a little bit about my grandparents. Even as a child, I somehow understood my grandparents as the past. Like many other migrant Southerners, my mom sent me and my siblings back home in the summers. I loved everything about these Mississippi visits with Pa and Monk, as we called my mom's parents. The time I spent with them had a profound influence on the adult I would become. When I visited Ori and Grace Berry growing up, they still lived in the home they had bought in 1951 after selling their farm just northwest of town. A single-story Victorian with a tall roof to trap the heat, the house sat on a double-corner lot in the downtown section of Prentice. Fans, features that were at that time as rare in suburbia as Victrolas with horns, spun in the center of the high ceilings. A few window air conditioning units produced more noise than cool air. In the kitchen, an old-fashioned sink with a wide porcelain sideboard splayed out under a sunny window. In the den, a picture of a rooster made out of dried beans and seeds crowed over a nutty brown couch. And in the in the bathroom, a seemingly giant clawfoot tub invited me in for a bubbly swim. Everything about the place seemed more interesting and special and somehow more real than what we had at home. Home for me was then suburban Atlanta. And then I go on to describe the town itself and how it had an old-fashioned charm and its own businesses, and not at all the kind of suburban place that I was accustomed to living. And most magically for me as a child, you could walk everywhere. I don't know if anyone else is a child of suburbia, but the thing that I hated about growing up in suburbia is not being able to walk anywhere. There weren't any places you could walk, there weren't even sidewalks, and I've always lived in places that are not like that when I've had the choice. but that was the thing that was so appealing to me as a child. But I'm going to skip ahead and just read a little bit about my grandfather. The very best thing about my Mississippi visits was my grandfather. Because my grandmother worked half days then at the Chancery Clerk's office, I spent a lot of time on these trips wandering the countryside with my grandfather. Most days we stopped at country stores and bought Cokes and candy bars. More than once we listened to the sing-song twang of auctioneers and bid on cows we never intended to buy. And always, as he drove, he talked. Pa's stories transformed the buggy pastures and swampy woods of Jeff Davis County into a dense and magical landscape, layered with traces of the people, buildings, and relationships that had come before. Driving the backwoods, he would point out the open window of his GMC truck to a spot where the jonquils bloomed in a line in an empty field, and conjure the now vanished Brady Farm or the Mount Carmel settlement with his words. Or he would stop suddenly on the weedy shoulder of a dirt road and say, "I think this is it." Bushwhacking back through tangles of blackberry bushes, he would uncover a choked spring that he remembered from his youth. Miraculously, to this suburban girl at least, we would kneel and drink the clear, cool, and delicious water straight from that muddy ground. Besides being a child's best possible companion, the grandfather I knew was respected by family, friends, and neighbors. His parents on both sides had owned farms, his grandparents, but he had grown up hard because his own father was an alcoholic, a serious problem for a person to have in a state that held on to prohibition until 1966. Most people don't know that, but Mississippi wasn't going to give it up. As a boy, he worked so hard that he missed a lot of school. And against his own family's wishes, he married my grandmother, who came from a very impoverished family and was considered, quote, an old maid at the age of 23. And he loved her fiercely until the day he died. As an adult, he helped his 7 siblings when necessary, and especially a sister who never married and a brother who lived with a disability. I was a teenager who could drive, and Pa was dead by the time Lorraine Lockhart, a black woman who operated a little country store near a piece of property that he had owned, moved into her new place. But Miss Lorraine, as I was taught to call her, gave me a tour of her new home and told me that my grandfather had helped her with the paperwork for the federal government program, probably a Farmers Home Administration loan, that had enabled her to build a brick house and her first home with indoor plumbing. My grandfather taught me to love history. In the slow, wet heat of those Mississippi summers, I got tangled up in the very past that my parents were trying to leave behind. When I was a child, that world often felt more like home to me than the Atlanta suburb where I actually lived. But love is not the same thing as knowledge. It would take decades for me to realize how little I understood about my grandfather and the history that he had helped make. So that's just to give you a taste of who he is a person. And I want to shift now to talk about Versie Johnson. And again, given the work that many of you do, you may know this, but white supremacy doesn't just shape the structures of our society today, and it doesn't just shape collective memory in the sense that white people have had more power at certain times to tell their stories about the past, but it also very much shapes the archives. And I think that's something that not everyone thinks about, but it shapes the documents that survive, the way that those documents are collected, the way that they're created, and what survives for us to actually use today to study the past. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about that and then just dig into what I found out about Versie Johnson and his family. Sometimes official documents record the lives of Black people, but just as often these archives also erase them. Of the 41 pieces of evidence I have located that refer to Versie Johnson's life, fewer than 10 directly address what he did before his last days. In almost every case, officials struggled to get his name right, rendering it variously Versie, Versie, and Vernon across 3 census reports, a birth certificate, a World War II draft registration, and 2 mentions in a small town paper. It's not much to work with, fragments rather than a whole. A man described not so much by how he lived, but by how he died. And yet it is enough to see the outlines of a time when Versie Johnson had a future. And I want to just continue to talk a little bit about this, because to talk about Versie Johnson is also to talk about the struggle to find him. I will say, I say this later in the book, but I spent a huge amount of time trying to find his family. I know, again, in some of the reconciliation work some of you were doing, you've found descendants of people. And I have not been able to locate any of his relatives. I went so far as to cold call a lot of people's cell phone numbers. I'm sure they wondered who the crazy person was calling them. Wrote many, many letters to everyone that I thought could be related to him and to all of the surviving Black churches in the area, and et cetera, et cetera. I was never able to find his family. In part, that might be because Johnson, frankly, when I started doing this research, I decided Johnson was the most popular name for black people in the Deep South. But that's probably not true, but it is a very, sorry?
I'll testify to that.
Yeah, it's a very common name, and his parents are named Bill and Elizabeth, which gives you, or William and Elizabeth, which gives you all of the variations of William, all the variations of Elizabeth. And then you couple that with the fact that the census takers, always white people, are not, at least in the past, are not careful to get people's names right, especially not rural black people in the South. So really quite a struggle there. So I did not find his relatives, which I tried to do, but I did find a lot about him. So let me just talk a little bit about that. Unless they focus on elites, historians rarely have access to the inner lives of the people they write about. The majority of working people do not keep diaries or even family Bibles. And if they save letters and other family papers, these items are often lost over the years. While oral historians have worked to close some of the gaps by interviewing regular folks, not everyone gets a chance to tell their own story and have that record preserved in an archive. Anyone trying to recover the history of rural black people during the Jim Crow era faces an additional challenge. The way white supremacy shaped the institutions that reported the news, collected the data, and preserved the documents. Even the census, that once-a-decade record of all Americans, sometimes fails to account for black Southerners. And again, as some of you may well know, maybe some of you were genealogists, before 1870, the census never accounted in any way, shape, or form fully for the black population of this country, because in 1850 and 1860, the census did complete what they called the slave schedules, but those documents mostly did not list people by name. Occasionally there would be a first name, but usually it was just a gender and an age listed underneath an owner's name. And so in that way it becomes, genealogists who specialize in black genealogy and history call it the wall of 1870. It's really hard to get behind the wall of 1870. And so I actually feel lucky that I was able to do that. I was able to trace great-great-grandparents and great-grandparents, 2 greats and 1 great, back to a probable enslaver in what was then Lawrence County, Mississippi, of Versie Johnson's maternal side. And I was able to locate those relatives, and through the information in the census records, see that this great-grandmother had a kind of traveling across from Virginia to North Carolina to ultimately Mississippi. Again, some of you know this history because, of course, Alexandria was such a place of slave trading, right? But she is one of these people that had to make that journey west. And then I was able to find those folks reconstituted after emancipation, probably still living fairly close to where they'd been enslaved. You know, one of the things that kills you when you're trying to do this work is shifting county borders. No, no, no. Those are so problematic because it's very hard to know whether people are moving or the addresses are changing. Does that make sense? so that I can't say 100% for sure. If they're moving, they're not moving far. But Lizzie, Versie Johnson's mother, Lizzie, grows up in a household with her grandmother and her parents. That grandmother had been born during the time of enslavement, but a strong family, multiple generations. As many people are, they're sharecropping, trying to make a living in that way. It's a big family. There are 7 kids, including Versie Johnson. And they mostly spend their life right there at the boundary between Lincoln and Lawrence County. It's also the Piney Woods of Mississippi until some kind of tragedy happens. The census doesn't tell us what. They end up moving briefly to Rankin County. Then it seems as if the father dies and the family splits apart. And that is how Versie Johnson ends up in Jeff Davis County. One of his siblings, a couple of his siblings, Eula May is the first one, ends up moving to Jeff Davis County. This is an older sister of his. And she goes to work as a cook, as a live-in cook for a family, Fred and Nona Dale, in a house right in downtown Prentice, one of the fanciest houses. This is a very small town, but these are, you know what small town elites are. These are the big people in a very small place. Really what's interesting about that is that Nona Dale was a Berry, and she is a distant relative of my grandfather. So in this way, my family genealogy intersects distantly, but with Versie Johnson's in that way, that his sister is working there for a cousin of my grandfather, who was of a different branch of the Berry family, the not quite as well-off branch, I will say. And so eventually, Versie Johnson moves to Jeff Davis County because his sister is working there, and his dad dies, and he and his mom, and he has a younger sister, Gertrude, they move there to live with Eula May and her husband, and that's how they end up there. And then eventually Gertrude goes into domestic service as well, and Versie Johnson is working sometimes in a sawmill. This is the Piney Woods, after all, although almost all of the old growth forest all of it really is cut down by the late 1930s. So by 1947, it's not any of that left, but some second growth is being cut by that point. He works in sawmills. He also works doing deliveries for stores, and also doing other kinds of agricultural work. But I want to read you just a tiny bit and see if I can get this to work, and if I can't, I'll give up on it. Okay, well, there we go. All right, we'll just go through these really quickly. That's what Prentice looks like in 1921. That's my grandmother and grandfather right about the time they got married. Notice the log truck they're posed in front of. This is the 1930s. They're really industrial logging, this whole place. So one thing you've got to keep in your mind is this place is a ruin in the 20s and 30s. They're just devastated land everywhere that's been clear cut. And that's what Versie Johnson and my grandfather are growing up in, living in. This is my grandfather pouring liquor in the ditch. This is him. Prohibition, of course, still on in the 1940s until 1966. So, and this is interesting because this is the jail where they held Versie Johnson. This would be the jail. See that little part right there is an annex of the courthouse. But I want to put this up and then read a little bit about it. By the time Versie Johnson registered for the World War II draft, about 6 months after the 1940 census, he lived in DeLoe, a former sawmill town in Simpson County, surrounded by eroded stump-filled land where rents on what had been sawmill worker housing would have been low. So he's left home and moved off to the next county north to work. He must have had a car because he listed his employer as a white man named Alston White, a farmer and a store owner in Panola, a small town about 10 miles away from where Versie Johnson lived. Whether or not Johnson was bootlegging, and there's some evidence that he was a bootlegger, his brother-in-law that he lived with was known to sell illegal alcohol, and he might have moved to Simpson County to open a branch of that business, if that makes sense. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's likely. Whether he was bootlegging or even running a card game, his brother-in-law also was involved in running card games for money. His work for White probably included farm labor, as well as loading and unloading goods at the store and making deliveries. Johnson was not yet married, or he would not have given his mother's name as a contact, and you can see on the front here he's given his mother's name as the person who would always know his address. Both the front and the back of the draft registration, however, provide a great deal of information about Versie Johnson, given the dearth of other sources. But it's the back of the form that I'm drawn to, the part where the registrar filled in a physical description. It's the closest thing I have to a portrait of Versie Johnson, but like everything else in the Jim Crow era, it's an image that fuses some of what was actually present with all that white people refused to see. The registrar described Johnson as 5 feet 9 inches, not tall for a man, but not short either at the time. Recorded his weight as 175 pounds, again, an in-between measure, an indication that he was not too poor to eat well. She checked the box for black for his hair color and dark brown for his complexion. But it was the eyes that revealed that the description was as much about the white registrar's racism as about the man in front of her. She marked them as black too. The form gave that impossible option. No one actually has black irises. It set her up, but it seems unlikely that she really tried. To determine Johnson's actual eye color, this white woman would have had to stare into his eyes. She would have had to consider his particular humanity. She would have had to look. So I don't want to take too much more time before opening up for questions. I'm going to see what else I have on here to show, and then just sort of read something from the end of the book that tries to bring some of this story around to the present. That's a picture of my grandfather ended up serving 3 terms as sheriff, and you might recognize the fabulous sense of style on that young one. That is a 5-year-old me. Let's see if it's going to work. Okay, here is the birth certificate, which really helped me tremendously to find relatives. Here's the front page article that I was describing, another picture of the courthouse, the jail where Versie Johnson was held. This is giving us a glimpse of the direction towards which the places where he was killed. So Versie Johnson, this crime that he allegedly committed, it happened at the Lipsey farm. Some people were renters on that farm, and this is a tractor yard and a cotton gin, and see all the bales of cotton that the Lipseys owned. They were a very wealthy, for that place, let me not say very wealthy, for a very small town in a not rich part of Mississippi. They too were fairly elite there. They owned all of these businesses, and behind those cotton bales is the Lipsey farm. I can't resist this one because you really can't make up details like this. This is the site where Versie Johnson died. You can see what that looks like. It's a football field. It's the Segregation Academy's football field. So Jeff Davis County Christian, I think it's called Prentice Christian School. That's what it's called, Prentice Christian School. It was going to be called Jeff Davis Academy, but they decided to call it Prentice Christian School. And been operating, as if you know anything about this history, you might know, since 1970, since they forced that 1969 Supreme Court case forced Mississippi to finally integrate. 33, I think, of its districts were still not integrated in 1969. Shocking, right? But this is this property, this site is where the black community told me that Versie Johnson was killed. So let me just read a brief passage from the end and then open this up for questions. Beneath this local lie, the coverage of what actually happened to Versie Johnson, lay the bigger lies that served as the foundation of post-Reconstruction American life. That segregation and discriminatory voting requirements did not violate the Constitution. Lying was how the system worked, and most people knew that. For a time, the civil rights movement forced the lies into the open and broke them apart. And yet today, the radical promise of the Supreme Court's Brown decision remains only partially implemented. The Voting Rights Act lies in tatters. Few white people are even willing to talk about, much less support, the material reparations that might begin to address the harm caused by both slavery and segregation. And violence continues to deprive black people of their futures. In the last decade, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, like Versie Johnson, and of course like others, more since I have written this book, have also been killed by law enforcement officers. Others, like Ahmaud Arbery, have been killed by vigilantes. And while the particulars are important, both to the families of the people killed and to the process of trying to hold the perpetrators legally accountable, the details can obscure an important commonality. In all of these cases, the killers, whether law enforcement officials or not, believed that they were acting as the hands of the law. But the law enforcement officers do not have unlimited legal authority to act, and they too can be guilty of breaking the law, even when in their own minds they are enforcing it. In that sense, they too can become vigilantes. They can become lynchers. A Across American history, efforts to end this kind of vigilante violence, like the anti-lynching movement, love it that not 2020, wasn't it? We finally got that anti-lynching bill, federal anti-lynching bill. Somebody help me out here. It's 2020, right? Yeah. Have often had the unintended consequence of driving these acts underground. That can mean that perpetrators cover up what they do, but it can also mean that people who want to be the hands of the law, who want to feel like they personally hold the law's power, have an incentive to go into law enforcement work where they can act with greater impunity. Today, the lying continues. Rather than trying to stop vigilante behavior, many state laws encourage it. Stand your ground and open carry laws tempt citizens to act like law enforcement officers. More recently, state anti-abortion laws offer to pay rewards to citizens who police other citizens' reproductive health choices. Vigilantes are being transformed into heroes, but what many anti-lynching activists understood in the past remains true today. Citizenship is meaningless if a person's body is not safe. Protection from violence is the essential foundation of our democratic life. This ultimately is what my grandfather set out to kill on that day in 1947.
Thank you.